Our first word for Chapter 5 is pretty simple. It's futurity, which looks strangely like future, and that's exactly what it means. It simply means someone's future. The second word for Chapter 5 is superfluous. It looks like superfluous, but you pronounce it superfluous, and it means an overabundance, just too much of something. There's a superfluity of sunshine in a later chapter. The third word for this chapter is insidious, and it also has this kind of onomatopoeic meaning. Insidious. It sounds almost snake-like, and it means evil or treacherous. You'll see as we go along that Chillingworth certainly has an insidious intent. Put them all together and you could have a sentence like this. The superfluous insidiousness of the 8th grade girls pointed toward a somber or melancholy futurity for the hapless 7th grade boy with the back brace. Chapter 5. Not too much plot action this time around, but it is important to understand that a few years have passed, and Hester has since left the prison, and she stayed in Boston, which is very important because there's nothing in the decree of her Scarlet Letter that says that she must stay, but we'll talk about why she does in the quote section. Hester at her needle. The title comes from the idea that Hester is able to make a living, a pretty decent living, from sewing. She is extremely good at it. And she kind of becomes like the Tommy Hilfiger of all Puritan Boston. Everyone wants to be seen with a Hester Prynne pair of gloves, a shawl, or what have you. Except for one particular type of clothing is Hester allowed kind of free rein. The only other aspect of Chapter 5, really, is that at least for the first few years, the original purport, or the original driving force behind the Scarlet Letter, certainly wore on Hester. She felt very alone and isolated within that sphere that I mentioned, and at this point, the letter simply means adulteress. It has not begun to evolve in any shape or form. That will take some time. Quote number 1. This pertains to Hester's reasoning for staying in Boston, and this can be found in paragraph 3 towards the end. What she compelled herself to believe, what finally she reasoned upon, as her motive for continuing a resident of New England, was half a truth and half a self-delusion. Here, she said to herself, had been the scene of her guilt, and here should be the scene of her earthly punishment. And so, perchance, the torture of her daily shame would at length purge her soul, and work out another purity than that which she had lost, more saint-like, because of the result of martyrdom. Remember, one of the other Scarlet Letters is the idea of antinomianism, the idea that good works can win God's grace. And again, as I stated earlier, that is something very adversarial to a Puritan point of view, who would believe in predestination. Once in many days, or perchance in many months, she felt an eye, a human eye, upon the ignominious brand, that seemed to give a momentary relief, as if half of her agony were shared. The next instant, back it all rushed again, with a still deeper throb of pain, for in that brief interval, she had sinned anew. Had Hester sinned alone? Think about that. Most of the time, Hester's Scarlet Letter is glanced at by kind of iron-visaged physiognomies, or really stern looks, but every now and then one has to imagine that she catches the eye of her lover. And at the same time that makes her feel comfortable, or not comfortable, but comforted, she also has the same pangs of romantic feeling, and so she almost feels as though she sinned again. Quote, or section number 2. This can be found in paragraph 6. By degrees, nor very slowly, her handiwork became what would now be termed the fashion. She becomes the Tommy Hilfiger of her day. Everyone wants to be wearing a Hester Prynne. Her needlework was seen on the ruff of the governor. Military men wore it on their scarves, and the minister on his band. It decked the baby's little cap. It was shut up to be mildewed and moulder away in the coffins of the dead. But it is not recorded that, in a single instance, her skill was called in aid to embroider the white veil which was to cover the pure blushes of a bride. The exception indicated the ever-relentless vigor with which society frowned upon her sin. You can't have the town whore make your veil. That's tacky. But you can have the governor wear it on his gloves. Except for the small expenditure in the decoration of her infant, Hester bestowed all her superfluous means in charity on wretches less miserable than herself, and who not unfrequently insulted the hand that fed them. Hester begins her charitable work almost from the start, and she employs her seamstress skills to people who bite the hands that sews for them, as it were, and would probably be loath to thank her in public. By the close of Chapter 5, you do get the sense that the A is empowering Hester in some way. Although she's still really kind of down about it all in these first few years, there is something about the Scarlet Letter, and Hester describes it, or at least the narrator describes it via Hester's thoughts. She felt or fancied, then, that the Scarlet Letter had endowed her with a new sense. She shuddered to believe, yet could not help believing, that it gave her a sympathetic knowledge of the hidden sin in other hearts. It was like the scarlet sense. She sees sinful people. That was perhaps the worst pun I've ever made. She was terror-stricken by the revelations that were thus made. What were they? Could they be other than the insidious whispers of the bad angel who would fain have persuaded the struggling woman, as yet only half his victim, that the outward guise of purity was but a lie, and that if truth were everywhere to be shown, a scarlet letter would blaze forth on many a bosom besides Hester Prynne's? Or must she receive these intimations, so obscure yet so distinct, as truth? If you've read Nathaniel Hawthorne's The Minister's Black Veil, you can see in that story kind of the genesis of this idea. Hester has to wear her sin outwardly, and because of that, she is empowered with this kind of sense to see through people and to see their sin. It is part of the transformation that is beginning. Welcome, Sweetie, again. And if Hester Prynne were here, she'd be able to look right at Sweetie and tell me exactly where she peed on the carpet.